late for various reasons, but that's all right. We're going to get started anyhow. Some people are unable to make it. We have some people out of town. We have various reasons why people aren't here, but that's all right. We're going to go ahead and get started. You know, this is church work. A couple Sundays ago, we had 30 people here on a Wednesday night, and now we got a handful. It's a part of the journey. It's summertime. People are traveling and doing all sorts of things. So a couple of people will show up here. We'll fill in just a little bit. So we're going to be continuing our teaching series. So I debated for a very long time. I thought and meditated and prayed and considered my ways, and I was thinking, what is it should I do? What am I going to do? Am I going to move on or stay still or whatever? How are we going to go about this? And what I want to do is give us enough about these books so that when you're reading them independently, we can have an idea of what's going on. That's really what I'd like to accomplish. And so I was planning on speed running through the last half of Genesis and then moving on to Exodus or wherever book. But I feel impressed just to slow down a little bit. Not chapter to chapter, because that would take entirely too long. But we're just going to consider a section today, a section next week, and another section. So it'll take the next 3 weeks, and then we'll be done with Genesis. But to finish 50 chapters in 3 weeks, that's a thing to tackle. And so I'm not going to be able to do these topics justice, but we'll do the best that we can. So Genesis, we're talking about Abraham today. Talk about Abraham. His set of stories are probably among the most known stories of Genesis. These are very popular stories. So we'll just shout out a couple things. When we think about Abraham, what are some things that come to mind? Faith, father of many nations. Anybody else? Covenant. Anybody? Sacrifice. You said Isaac. Any places come up in your mind? Any events come up in your mind? We're getting most of his life here. Okay, well, that's all right. We'll move forward. So before I move on, I want to ask, did you notice anything strange when reading Abraham's story? Did anything stick out to you? Something that was odd? I'm sure there was many strange things because it happened like 3,000 years ago. But aside from the cultural differences, was there anything about the Abraham story that was just like, man, this is quite different? I got you. I'm going to help you guys out. You should be experiencing, when you're reading the Abraham stories, a sense of deja vu. If you haven't, I'm telling you that you should, because the way Abraham's life is laid out, there's a mirror right in the middle, and the events that happen in the first half of his life repeat in very similar circumstances in the second half. So much so that Abraham's life is perfectly symmetrical. His life is perfectly symmetrical. And so there's a couple of transitional chapters. That's Genesis chapters 23, 24, and 25. So we'll deal with that material a little bit later. But from when he's introduced in Genesis 11 all the way to Genesis 22, you see the same sort of events that happen in his life happen a second time. His story starts with a genealogy. It ends with a genealogy. There's some adventure that he embarks on, and that journey seems to have this big climactic moment. He lies to a king of a nation, and then he does it again later in his life. He rescues Lot from danger once, and him and God rescue Lot from danger a second time. These repetitions. There's a covenant story in Genesis 15, and there's another covenant story in Genesis 17. There's so much repetition. There's even repetitions here that I don't have on the board. Like, there's 2 incidents with Hagar. He cast her out twice. And so it's like his story is split right in half. And the reason why this feature of his story is so important is because this gives us insight on how to read the Abraham story so that we're able to get the most out of it. This information helps us give us some tools and skills to more accurately discern what the text is saying. And what that looks like, and I'm going to model tonight, is that when you look at this pattern, this is a very simplified version. You can Google this pattern. You just type in the chiasm of Abraham's life. You'll get some that are really detailed. Like this only has a couple letters through E. There's some that'll go through X, Y, Z, and so they'll have 26 points on one way and 26 points in the other way. So they can get quite detailed. And so, but I just want to give you a little overview. And what I'm going to do is, what you want to do is read these events in light of one another. And these mirrored stories help us to understand what's happening. There's something about this genealogy that informs this genealogy. There's something about the embarking and the climax of the journey. There's something about et cetera, that tells us and helps inform our interpretation of the text. As well as, if you look here, what's in the very center of his story, to me, was the oddest feature. The very center, which when you look at this pattern, right, which is A, B, C, D, E, and then that apostrophe is called a prime, right? There's E prime, that's supposed to be D prime, C prime, B prime, and A prime. That's what it means. And so these are matched and linked. But what's in the very middle is the story where Abraham kicks Ishmael and Hagar out the camp. That is, we are talking about the father of the Israelite people. He's the father of faith, this great man. And the author, Moses, is drawing your attention to this moment in his life. Interestingly, I think, if you wanted to paint the father of your people and the father of your religion, I'm sure you would want to paint him in the most positive light possible. But that's not the route that Moses went. There's a message. We'll come back to that. I think that's a very interesting point, and we'll explore that there in just a little bit. So let's look at some genealogies. Genealogies are this person had this person, had this person, had this person, right? It's like Ancestry.com of somebody that you don't know. So it's not nearly as exciting. You know that person that shows you their Ancestry.com and like they're really excited, but you can't really get as excited because it's not your family? Yes, that's what we're reading right now. They're like, oh look, this is my cousin. That's like 3 people removed. This is super exciting. You're like, that's cool. I'm glad that's your cousin, right? That's why we have that sentiment when we read the genealogies. It feels like somebody else's family story, and so we kind of check out just a little bit. But I want to draw some things to your attention that I think might be helpful. Let's look at Genesis 11, start at verse 27. So Genesis 11, verse 27. It says, now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, begat, a modern English is sired, because men can't give birth, but they can sire children. So there you go. That's the equivalent of this word. So Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So Terah had 3 sons. Okay. And Haran, he begat Lot. Lot's important. Okay. The very next verse. Now, Haran, he died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees. So Terah, which is Abraham's father, he witnessed the death of his son. His son died before he did. That's tragic. The natural order of things is that parents should die first. And so the very little that we do know about Terah, we don't know much about him, but his life isn't particularly happy. He had the unfortunate experience of experiencing the death of a child. Okay. And that's also giving us some insight. What often happened is that kids would live under the canopy of their fathers until they got their inheritance, and then they would go out and be the patriarch of their family. Well, if Lot's father is dead, well, to whose family is he going to belong? He used to belong to some family. Maybe it was that Abraham took Lot under his wing at a very young age, and they developed a relationship early on. He was like a big brother figure to him for so long, so that when he left the country we'll get there. When he left this country, there was probably some attachment. It's likely the case. Verse 29, and Abram and Nahor took to them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife is Milcah. And the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Ishka. Fun fact, just if you ever want to be that person in the room, the way you pronounce Abraham's name here is Avram. It's a V sound. It's not a B sound. It's a V sound. So if you want to be that person, you're welcome to be. It's technically Avram. You know, you'll get mixed response depending on who you're talking to. They might think you're being extra, and that's certainly fine. But it'd be pronounced Avram. Okay. Also, Milcah is derived from the word Melech. Oh, that's Malek, is that word. Melech, king. Yes. So Milcah is queen, and Sarai means princess. So the more you know. There's a whole thing behind that, but I won't go there. All right, verse 30. But Sarai was barren. She had no children. She had no child. So this is the story of Terah. All right. So Terah's story is the death of a son, and his daughter-in-law can't have children. So it's death and barrenness. Not a very great way to start Terah's story. We don't know much about Terah, but there's a lot of setbacks in his life. So, verse 31, Terah took Avram. He took Avram, his son, and Lot, that's how that's pronounced, but Lot, if you will, the son of Haran, his son's son, right, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Avram's wife, and they went forth with them from the Ur of Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan, and they came unto Haran, and they dwelt there. So he had a son named Haran, and they went to a place called Haran. He had a son named Haran, and he went to a place named Haran, right? Okay. Just in case you're getting confused. And this sentence is confusing in the King James, so let me clarify what he's saying. I wish I had a map. So, I want you to imagine this. Did everybody take a picture of this? Everybody have a picture? You can take one. And let's see if you can swiftly. Hopefully that picture's taken. Oh, there we go. This exact thing is posted on the Slack. You didn't take a picture. So there you go. So, let's say I'm going to draw a really not great map, but it's going to get us most of the way there. So here's Israel. Then this right here would be Syria, maybe what we would call Syria. This is like Jordan, Moab would be here, just to give us reference, right? Give us this. And then there's like this massive plot of land, desert area, plots of land and other things. We have two rivers. It goes into the Persian Gulf. Not very good picture, but it'll get us there, right? And then here's these rivers here. So there's one river, Euphrates, Tigris. And here is There's This is like the region of Babylon. Assyria would be further up here. And then over here is like Turkey. Okay. Not a great map. Hopefully we can get, and we'll just put desert. So desert here. Okay. So he travels up to Haran. There's some mountains up here. They're at the base of the mountain. And they're trying to go here where Israel is. So here's the Mediterranean Sea. And then it drops down to Egypt and Africa. So Egypt, so this over here is Africa. Kind of oriented. This is not a great map, but Africa, this is where they wandered in the wilderness. So here's the Mediterranean Sea. I don't know how to spell Mediterranean, so I'll put Midi. And so like Europe will be over here. So here's Europe, here's Africa, the Mediterranean Sea, here's Israel. Okay. Well, it was the land of Canaan at this time. They were trying to make it to the land of Canaan. Lots of desert here, so you don't just walk through here, just like trade routes. So they go up north to Haran, because remember, the part that's a bit confusing is verse 31. It says a whole lot of wordy business here. He was trying to make it to Canaan, the father, and he never did. He went to Haran, so he traveled way up north, died there, trying to make it to Canaan. And so, and it's from there, the irony is, it says that God called Abraham out of the Ur of Chaldees, but he was with his father at the time. So technically, his homeland is the Ur of Chaldees, which is Babylon. So Abraham is from Babylon, but he departed from Haran, which is way in the north, down to Canaan, along trade routes. Because trade routes would be along rivers, because that's safe, and not through deserts. And so, okay. So my poorly drawn map. I need to work on my cartography skills. That way I can produce better maps for you folks. But that's as good as it's going to get for now. Between Moab and Israel, that's where the Jordan River is. And then you go down, there's like the Dead Sea and all that stuff's right there. We have friends that would know that region a little bit better than I would. But okay. And so there's all of that. So this is how the Abraham story begins. With this genealogy. The purpose of the genealogy, and it's the same purpose for all of them in Genesis, is that it lets you know who the important characters are and where the story is going, generally. So Terah dies, and the focus is on Abraham and his family, so we know that the main characters of the story that are coming up are going to be Abraham and his family. Let's look at Genesis 22. We're going to read another genealogy. I have much less to say about this one, so we won't be so bogged down on genealogies tonight. Genesis 22 and verse 20. And it came to pass that after these things that it was told Abraham, so somebody told Abraham this, saying that, behold, Milcah, so that's his, right, his sister-in-law? Sister-in-law. Yes, his sister-in-law, Nahor's wife. She hath borne children unto the brother Nahor. Huz is the firstborn. Buz is the brother. Kemuel, the father of Aram. Chesed, which is an incredible name. Hazo, Fildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. And Bethuel begat Rebekah, or in Hebrew was Rivkah. Rivka is her name. And this is important because who is Rebecca? Yes, Isaac's wife. And what's the very next story after this? Well, Sarah dies, but then after that, it's the story of Isaac finding a wife. She's being introduced here. So it's telling us who the main characters are, right? So it lets us know that, verse 24, and his concubine, whose name was Reumah, she bare also Teva, Gaham, Thahash, and Ma'achah. And so those are the rest of the family. And I'm sure if you trace those genealogies, they have some part in the story too. But, okay. And so I say all that to say, so we know that when we read genealogies, they matter because they do two functions. They mark the borders of literary units. So this is a contained section between genealogies. So that's how you can mark the sections of a book. And the other function is it lets you know who the main characters are. Okay. Let's move on to the second part of the chiasm. Do you remember what it was? You remember what B said? If you're not, it's in the slag. What was B? B and B prime was about. B and B prime. Pull it up. You have the answer. Huh? Yes. Abraham's journey. I was studying this today, and what I got out of this was incredible. My goodness, it's so interesting. Okay, so we have Abraham. You have Abram's journey, and then you have the climax of the journey. Now, what's interesting about these is you can divide it something like this. Verse 1, verse, let me just say 2 to 3, and then we'll just say 4 for now, it's fine. And then this is in chapter 12. This is in chapter 22, so you know where it's at. And we're going to, verse 1 matches verse 19. This section here of blessing matches 15 through 18. And this last part here matches 1 through 14. So we're going to see. This is where it gets really cool. Okay. Here, he's called out of Ur. He's leaving. This one, he's going, see, I reversed the symbols. He's going to Beersheba, or Be'er Sheva, that's how you would say that. Okay, so what does this mean? The journey starts with him coming out of his homeland. It starts with God asking him to do something very difficult. He says, you're going to lose your sense of place. You're going to lose the home which you grew up, which means all your connections, where you've let down your roots, everything you've known about life, your everything, your culture. He said, you let that go. How does this story end? The story ends with him going home. He left a home, but God provided a home for him. He left Ur, and if you don't know where Be'er Sheva is, it's in Canaan. It was in the promised land. His story was able for him to end with him in the promised land. He left where God had called him, and he ended up in the promised land. He left his home, and he gained a new home. So, some significance for us. If you think about Abraham, he could be the example of what it means to be a new convert. Because that's what he is. When he comes on the scene, this is somebody who's brand new to faith. So if you're brand new to faith, this means a lot to you, or it should. Walking with God is a call to sacrifice. There's what you've known up until that point that God comes into your life. You have been informed by the culture that you were in. You were informed by your life experiences. You've been informed by the issues and the problems that have happened to you. They have shaped your experience, and that is your home. Your home is your culture. Your home is your trauma. Your home, these are the things that are home and your identity, everything that you are. And coming to God, the very first thing that he asks is you need to lay all of that down. Because following me is a totally brand new life. He was in Babylon. Some scholars think that his family might have made idols. We know at the very least he worshipped the moon god, because in Ur, that's the god that was worshipped, was the moon god. He had to lay down his whole life, because Ur was a key city. There was a giant tower in that city. So every day, the commerce, the money, the exchange, his whole life was centered around the worship of this moon god. Her name is Sin, is her name. Spelled like sin, but it's pronounced Sin. So his whole life was centered around this. His coming and his going, his every dollar spent, every morning, every evening. There's festivals that he lived. That was his whole life. But the same thing is true for all of us. We have those things. We've lived life a certain way up to this point. We have a rhythm to our life. Well, this is how my family gets along, or this is how we celebrate different holidays. This is how we resolve conflict. This is how we build relationships. This is how we manage problems. This is how we deal with the stress of life. We have all of this. And God says, walking with me, the very first thing you need to do is lay that down. Jesus did not make up that concept whole cloth. He said, if you're going to be my disciple, what do you have to do? Deny yourself. When he says hate mother, father, brother, sister, he's not talking about a literal hate. What he's talking about is denying culture. The thing that he asked you to do to be his disciple is exactly what Abraham had to do to follow God. This is walking with God. It's the connection, right? Okay, that's only the first point there. It gets better, right? So then it talks about the blessing. And then the blessing here gets, somebody pull up Genesis 12. Read verses 2 and 3. And then somebody go to Genesis 22. Let's start at verse 15. Bless, curse, in you. Those are all the main elements. Okay. Somebody pull up Genesis 22, start at verse 15, read 15, 16, 17, and maybe 18. If it's not 18, I'll stop you. Good? Yep. So what's interesting is that the blessing of Genesis 12 is made more clear by what's happening in Genesis 22. It brings it into focus, right? Notice that it said that in you, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. That's pretty vague. But then the focus comes. He says, through your seed, through your descendants, the nations are going to be blessed. Your descendants are going to be the method by which the worlds are blessed. Well, there's a seed of Abraham that rises above all the other descendants. This seed of Abraham is the son of David. This seed of Abraham is the son of David from the tribe of Judah, this seed is Jesus. And Galatians 3 says that when we're in Christ, we're in Abraham. When we're born again, our relationship with Jesus allows us to receive the blessing that was promised to Abraham. Now, I could do a whole lesson on what the blessing of Abraham is. In fact, to understand that blessing, you'd have to read Genesis 1 through 11, because that blessing is described there, and he says this is what you get. But if I can put it in seed form, it's like this. The blessing that Abraham gets is you get Eden all over again. What Adam lost, Abraham, in you, the world is going to get it back. In you, the world is going to get Eden back. That's what it means to be blessed. To be blessed is that what we had in Eden was what did Eden have? There was no death, no disease. There was always abundance. And there was access to God with no barrier. Am I describing Genesis 3 or Revelation 22? Exactly. That's the point. John the Revelator understood that where this hall is going is where it started. That's the blessing. When the promise of Christianity is simple. You get in Christ. And you stay in Christ. And this is the promise that the writers are saying. There's going to come a day when all the pain that you're experiencing, gone. All the suffering that you're experiencing, gone. There's going to come a day, this feeling of not being enough, that feeling is going to be wiped away. Every tear you cry, you're going to be in a place where there's no more tears to cry because of the joy unspeakable that you get to experience every day. The feeling of true fulfillment, you get that every single day. You're equipped with purpose and meaning, and for eternity, you get to collaborate with the Lord and live a maximally meaningful life every single day. And Lily's getting excited with me, right? This is the promise. This is the promise. Okay, right? And then, oh my goodness. This is the point that struck me the most, was this one right here. It's actually more verses than this. I would have to check it out. I think it's through 8 or maybe 9. I'll have to check. So he obeys, and then he builds an altar. He obeys, and he builds an altar. You cannot appreciate the sacrifice. So what's happening here in Genesis 22, 1 through 14, for some of our friends that might not know, what's happening is God promised Abraham that you're going to have a son, okay? And the problem was he was 75, and his wife was 74, and she was barren. They didn't actually have the kid until the wife was 99, and he was 100. So this was a literal miracle baby. He said, you're going to have this miracle child. So they have this miracle child at 100. And then God says to him about this miracle child, go on this mountain and kill this child. And as you can imagine, that is quite a distressing moment. Yet, Abraham, knowing God's character, trusts God, goes to do the sacrifice, but of course God intervenes because God is not with child sacrifice. He condemns it throughout the Bible. What's interesting is Genesis 12 lets you know why Abraham had the faith for Genesis 22. You see, let me tell you what happened. So what did he do? God called him out of the country of Ur. And he said, so Abraham, 1, he obeyed. And then 2, what happened after that is that he would meet God. He would have encounters with God, and he would build an altar. Every time he encountered God, every time he had an experience with God, he built an altar. So you're not catching it. See, what happened was, every time, altar building for Abraham was a sign of relationship. He went through all of Canaan, and he built many altars. There were testimonies of him encountering the presence of God in ways that no one else was. And so for Abraham, altars became a symbol of relationship. For him, sacrifice meant relationship. For him, sacrifice meant I'm about to encounter God. So when God told him to sacrifice his son, he already knew I'm about to encounter God. And so when he went on the mountain, I don't know what the encounter is going to be. So even if the boy dies, if God shows up, he can raise him even from the dead, because he knew wherever an altar was, God was there to be with him. I would not have noticed that if this wasn't brought to my attention. The reason why he was so comfortable is because he already had that association. Altars mean relationship. Altars, sacrifice means the presence of God. And he knows that the greater the sacrifice, the greater I can expect God to meet me at that moment of sacrifice. This moved me so much. I'm like, oh my goodness. No wonder he could be so faithful. No wonder Abraham could be the father of faith. It's because before he was a father of faith, he was a man of sacrifice. If you're going to be a person of faith and you walk in faithful obedience, you need to have a life that is marked by sacrifice. And nobody likes the call to sacrifice. It's uncomfortable. Nobody likes the call to sacrifice. It's not pleasant. But the promise that we have is whatever we sacrifice, whether it's our time, whether it's our talent, whether it's the resources that we have, maybe it's cutting off some relationships, whatever the sacrifice it is, we can rest assured knowing that God would meet us in that sacrifice. That's probably one of the biggest barriers for people walking with God, because walking with God is a call to sacrifice, and you worry your way, but I promise you, God will never allow himself to be indebted to anyone. Anything that you sacrifice, he will pay it back more abundantly. Anything we sacrifice, it is paid back more abundantly. Your time is not wasted being spent in prayer. You said, I could be doing so many other things, making money, doing A, B, C, and D, and the best thing that you can do to make your life successful is sacrifice in prayer, in attending services, in reading your Bible, in fasting. There is no more effective way to use your time. Because when you sacrifice that time, he blesses and touches everything else. So imagine a day, and you have all 16 hours to do whatever you want, but that's 16 hours. But if you say, God, I'll take this 30 minutes, or I'll take this 15, or I'll take this hour, and I'm going to pray, then he will bless the rest. Okay. Let's move on. What's C? C is the deception of the kings, right? And so there's the king. Is it Gerar or Gerar? How do you spell it? It's in Genesis 20. It's Abimelech, his country. There we go. Someone get there. Genesis 20. Gerar. Gerar. Okay. All right. This one is going to be a matter of discussion. I killed a fly earlier. Here's another one. They just keep proliferating. My God. Okay. What's interesting about this is, see if I can get my hat. If it lands, I might be able to get it. So, Okay. There it is. There's a interesting question. I didn't get it. There's an interesting question, huh? that arises when you read these stories. Um, I'm going to review what happened in these stories. And then I want you to see if you can see the difficulty that's in them. Because it happens in both stories. Okay, so Abraham goes to Egypt first, and he goes to Egypt, and this is what he says. He says to his wife, hey, I want you to tell the people that you're my sister, which kind of true because it's his half-sister. Okay, like, cultures are different, times are different. Remember, he's Babylonian. What the Babylonians did is what Babylonians did. Now, whatever. And so I don't condone that. That's odd. But either which way, that's a side point. And so he does that. He uses deception. The king of Egypt says to him, hey, by the way, your sister is an incredibly beautiful woman, so here's this dowry. I would like to marry her. And so this is the whole story. He offers a dowry, and Abraham, knowing this is his wife, accepts the dowry. And then the king of Egypt would like to officiate the marriage, and then plagues happen. Plagues come to the nation. Abraham knew. And so the story starts to wrap up. And what's interesting is, one, he never gives the stuff back. He said, here, you take these things and leave my country. No punishment to Abraham. Okay. The story in the Gerar with Abimelech. This is down in the Philistia, so like southeast Israel is where this is happening. It's in Canaan. And so he goes into this country, much of the same stuff. Hey, tell him you're my sister. And the king of Abimelech, it's Avimelech, as my father is king, is what that means. And he says, okay, sure, we'll do that. And he's like, also, massive dowry, which Abraham takes again. Takes this money, knowing that that is his wife indeed. And this is different. The king gets a dream. And the king does something interesting. God says, how dare you sleep with another man's wife? Abimelech responds, well, I was deceived. I'm righteous. Are you going to punish me because I'm righteous? That's not just. So he mouths off to God, because Abimelech is here for all of that smoke. Completely mouths off to God. God's response, even though Abimelech is the victim, God's response was, that man is a prophet. You appease him and he will bless you. And so he gives a bunch of stuff to Abraham. Abraham prays, and all the women can now have children in that country. That's the story. You got to think about that. Abraham did something wrong, by our standard at least. He used deception, and he caused other people to be in danger, and he put his wife in danger. And this is the part that we got to open for discussion. God defended Abraham both times. Why did God defend Abraham when he did something, whether you consider unethical, maybe adjusting for the time period, if you look at Second Temple period Judaism, they think about deception very differently to how we think about deception. So maybe it might not have been. So adjusting for sensitivity to the culture on the time, at the end of the day, Abraham did set everybody up. At the very least, he did set them up, yet God defended him. Why? So, being in covenant means God co-signs everything that we do. The chosen. Yeah. Yes, I think it's very similar. I think that's like I think that concept is being mirrored is mirroring what happened with Abraham. But the problem is all it did was push the problem then. Why would God so basically what we can discern from this is God commits himself to a people even if they're kind of scummy. Like a so okay. So there we go. See, the conversation is going in a direction. So if you think about it like a parent and a child, if anybody has kids, you'll know your kid can do some pretty awful things. And you're like, yeah, but that's my kid, and somebody got to be there for him. And, you know, and so you have a high tolerance. There's things that your kids can do to you as a parent that you would cut anybody else off. Like, done. Right? And so, relationship seems to be a big thing here. There's a whole book that explores this concept. It doesn't resolve it, but it explores a very interesting idea. It's called The Violence of God by Daniel Hawk. It's a good book. And the basic thing that he asserts in the book is because he wants to make sense of how can God tell the people to go into Canaan and kill children? How do you make sense of that violence? And the basic idea is if the more transcendent God is, the more removed he is, it is much simpler for him to execute his judgment and word in the world. But the deeper that God gets involved in human affairs, particularly through the people of Israel, he has to balance his justice with his covenant promises. And we don't get an explanation always to why God does what he does. But what we're supposed to see is the tension between his promise and his justice. And then spend the rest of our life thinking about that tension. Because the Bible doesn't give an answer. Because there's some people who read these stories and they're really uncomfortable with the fact that God seems kind of morally ambiguous here. You know? He seems kind of morally ambiguous, but then a guy touches the Ark of the Covenant and he takes him out. Right? And so you see these different stories and you're like, what is God like? And so to give clarity to that point is there's different expectations for a level of knowledge. Uzzah was a Levite. He knew better. And so there's a judgment according to knowledge. And so you could say that Abraham still really didn't know God. He was still learning. Keep in mind, he was a pagan for 75 years. He just met this God the latter part of his life. And this might make people uncomfortable. I'm not persuaded that Abraham had completely stopped believing in those other gods yet. So it was a process. He was learning to be monotheistic. And so, you know, if the moon god says I can lie, then, you know, whatever, I guess I can lie. He's becoming the child of God that he was supposed to be over time. It took the people of Israel quite a bit of time. By that, I mean a whole exile and coming back. And then they kind of got it straightened out then. And so I don't have much more commentary besides leaving you with this tension, and we can be okay with it. And I think that'll be good enough. Okay. This one's more interesting. So it's the rescue of Lot, right? And the rescue of Lot, man. So there's the, I'll say, that's the other one. Yes. So there's the physical rescue, and then there's, you could say, the spiritual rescue. this is Lot in both cases. So this is Genesis 14, and this is Genesis 18. So there's a couple of things to point out. By the way, the context of the war in which he got taken and where he had to be rescued by Abraham is complicated. So there was 2 coalitions. There was 4 kings from Mesopotamia. So that's between the 2 waters. So like Iraq, right? Those 4 kings in the country of Iraq, they all worked together. One was the king of Babylon, and one was the king of Persia. So they were in a coalition, and then there was another 5 kings that were in Canaan, so where Israel is. So Iraq and Israel basically were fighting with each other, but not quite that. So no. I'm talking Israel is over here, and then way over there, and beyond the desert is where Iraq and where Persia and all that would be. Is a bit separated. So what's happening is there's one king, Chedorlaomer. I'm gonna just call him Ched because it's easier to say. So Ched is a king, and this king went to war in his 13th year as king. And who he's fighting is really interesting rabbit hole that I won't go through. He's fighting the Rephaim. Do we know who the Rephaim are? They're the giants. Rephaim, the Anakim, Nephilim, all those are synonyms in the Bible. Even Amalekites, really. All those are synonyms. He's fighting giants. There's a bunch of clans of giants, and so he's going to war with them in the 13th year. And so that war is just happening. In the 14th year, that war isn't done yet. So he has a coalition of other kings with him, and they're fighting this war. The next year, what happens is this king has vassals. That means he's conquered other nations, and they pay him taxes. One of those were Sodom and Gomorrah. So that's 2 of them. They were 2 different countries. Sodom and Gomorrah were 2 vassals, and they decide he's distracted fighting these giants. So you know what we should do? We should rebel and fight. And so Sodom, Gomorrah, Zeboim, and there's 2 others. They get together. Let's rebel against King Ched. What they didn't account for was that he was in a coalition with other kings. And so that rebellion gets completely squashed because they fought on a terrain that wasn't in their favor. So that rebellion was completely squashed. And King Ched was so angry. He says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go and take the goods from your lands. And when he did that, he took Lot. Because Lot was in a country that was rebelling against their king. And that's how Lot got caught up in that. Lot had nothing to do with it. It was just a bunch of politics that was happening. So it was a nation who was in 2 different campaigns at the same time. And Sodom still lost. So you know Sodom was a weak nation. Was not powerful at all. Did not win. They couldn't. Even with, that's a lot of resources. If you're fighting like the giants, those are some really notable warriors, right? Like Og of Bashan, he was another one. Like, these are like, and so you would imagine that a lot of their resources were being drained militarily. And Sodom and Gomorrah still lost the fight. So they were really weak nations. So that's how Lot gets caught up in a situation. So the reason why that matters, because it's not just a little rant, this is to show you how powerful these nations are. These are powerful nations, powerful armies. Abraham gets about 318 dudes and say, let's go Navy SEALs, guerrilla warfare, sneak into their camp at night and fight. And he did. And he won. 318 people. That was it. And he fought off these kings and won. Of course, he attacked them at night and used some strategy, right? He wasn't beating 4 of the largest nations at the time. There's no way. But, I mean, God helped him, so yes, way with the Lord. But, but he also used a lot of strategy. He attacked at night, he ambushed them. But the point is, with 318 people, he beat a massive army. We have some veterans here, or we have some people who are serving in the military. That's crazy. Could you imagine our Air Force going to war with another? Let's say for whatever reason we want to fight Britain, right? Because Britain has a pretty good Air Force. And they sent out 100 planes, and we sent out 10. And we still won. That's a flex. That's what Abraham did. And he rescued Lot. Now, what's interesting is Lot gets in trouble again in Sodom and Gomorrah, because this time, now this is what you have to pay attention to. The way that this gets significant is there's certain slots happening here. You want to see how they're being fulfilled here. So here, Sodom and Gomorrah were in war with another king, and they lost. And this one, who is Sodom and Gomorrah going against? God. So God's the king. They're resisting God's rule. They're rebelling against God. Same with rebelled against King Ched, because they were supposed to be a vassal. So Sodom and Gomorrah is in rebellion against God, and God is going to squash that rebellion. And because the people were rebellious, not even Lot, because the people were rebellious, Lot got caught up in it. The same thing happened in this story, right? The people were rebelling against their king, and Lot got caught up in it. And so Abraham sent an army the first time. So the warfare the first time was an army. How did Abraham intervene the second time? He prayed. The slot of the army in the Sodom and Gomorrah story was the intercession with God. When you are interceding with God in prayer, that is effectively going to war. The concept of spiritual warfare is not just a modern thing that some churches thought of to sell a book. The same slot narratively is the way that we war is with our prayer. Now, what's interesting, that means when we pray, that means we're Abraham. That means when we're in intercession, it's like we're wrestling with God. Jacob was not the first one to wrestle with God. Abraham wrestled with him 2 generations before. Intercessory prayer is how we wrestle with God. When we are interceding and we're standing in the gap for somebody, and so let's say there's somebody that you know who's really going through it. They're having a really tough time with it. When you say, I'm going to pray for this person, I'm going to go to God for this person, and this person could be wayward and they're not living for God, and they can be anti-God, and this person could be kind of a knothead, and you say, God, they don't really deserve your mercy, but I'm praying and I'm seeking anyway. God, give them mercy. They've earned judgment. They've earned this, whatever God has given toward them. And you're saying, God, I know that you're right to do this, but I want to go against what you're willing for their life and give them grace. You're going against God. You're warring with him. That's intercessory prayer. Moses wasn't the first to do it. Moses said, God told Moses, I'm going to kill all of these people. And Moses said, how about no? How about don't do that? Which means we need to be a little bit more bold in our prayers. We pray, God, if it be thy will. God, I know you intend to do this, but this would give you more glory if this would happen. God, I'm interceding for this right here. But that's the key. You can't resist God for your flesh or what you want. When Moses resisted God, it was so his name could be glorified. Whatever you're praying for has to be glorifying God and not just advantage for yourself. You're not going to manipulate God. God is not playing that game. Trust me, he wasn't born yesterday. What you're praying for needs to glorify God. Even Abraham, that's what he was doing. He's saying, God, your name is so great because you're the God that spares the righteous. If there's even one righteous, you'll spare him, right, God? Abraham was fighting for God's name and honor. That's the only way you can resist God in prayer, if it's for his honor and for his glory, not for your own gain. And with that, I'm out of time. It is 8, and there is a whole nother parallel here, and I never got to address the Ishmael thing, which I think is incredible. How about this? Can I have 5 more minutes? I'll talk about Ishmael, and then we'll move on. We'll skip the covenants thing. It's okay. I've talked about the covenant things 100 times. I'll just take 5 minutes. We'll do Ishmael, and then we'll close it up. So think about this. So in the middle of the story, we have Ishmael right there in the middle. Why would Moses put Abraham's failure in the center slot for his story? Remember the formula. Remember the diagram we started with. It was the A, B, C, D, E, and then there was one story in the middle, and then E, B, C, D, A on the other side, or however, I'd say that backwards. E, D, C, D, A. There we go. Right? And so it was the literary design is drawing your attention to Ishmael and that whole situation where he kicked Hagar out. Why? I'm like, oh my goodness. I'm sitting there thinking, I said, Lord, if I was Moses, I wouldn't have done that. I would have put some highlight in the middle and say, this is Father Abraham. He had many sons. No, it was Father Abraham neglecting one of his sons. And what's interesting about that story is immediately on either side, 'cause that's in Genesis 16. Genesis 15 and Genesis 17. You know what both of those chapters are about? Covenant. Genesis 15 says God has made a unilateral covenant with us. And I'll save Genesis 17. Genesis 16 is Genesis 15 in reality. Genesis 15 says, and if you read the story, God committed himself to the people of Israel, but they never walked between the pieces. Only God did. Which means the promises are dependent on God alone and not the other parties in the covenant. What Genesis 16 demonstrates for us in narrative form is that the people of God, even when they're wicked, even though they're not perfect, even though they do make mistakes, God has committed himself to a flawed people. God has committed himself to a people that will fail him, that will let him down, and they will fall short. But his mercy and grace prevails. By showing Abraham's failure, we exalted God's mercy. The center of the Abraham story is that the story was never about Abraham. It was always about God's faithfulness to the covenant. The whole story is about God's faithfulness to the covenant, which means for us, we don't need to be perfect. We just need to get up and try again. Get up and try again. Because what did Abraham do after that? He got up, and from that moment, he became the righteous intercessor. He messed up in Gerar, but after that, he got up and what? He sacrificed Isaac. Abraham's failure was never the final word. His faithful obedience always followed every failure. That's what it's about. This is the Abraham story, and this is the meaning that it has for us. At the center of our walk with God is his faithfulness to us. And our decision that after every failure, I will get up and I will faithfully obey. This is, as the scholars will call it, this is the Abraham cycle. Okay, very good. And with 4 minutes over, we'll go cut it quits there. Thank you for joining me. Thank you. This was wonderful.